Welcome to this event by the Center for Philosophical Studies of History. My name is Georg Gangl. I'm the center's coordinator, and I will also be today's moderator. Today's speaker is James Connelly with the topic, Does Thinking Make It So? Gentile's Philosophy and Fascism. James is a professor emeritus of political theory at the University of Hull in the UK, and he is also one of the conveners of the Philosophy of History seminar of the Institute for Historical Research at the University of London. So a sister or perhaps competitor seminar to our own that we're currently having here right now. James' main research interests lie in British idealism and R.G. Collingwood, intellectual history, the politics and ethics of the environment, and electoral and voting systems. Now, James' most recent publication in the Philosophy of History is On First Impression, Translating Croce, Gentile, and De Ruggiero, I hope I somehow pronounced that correctly, in the journal Collingwood and British Idealism Studies. And from James's Phil paper page, I also gather that he has a paper forthcoming in the Journal of the Philosophy of History, which is called Italian Triangulations, R.G. Collingwood and His Italian Colleagues. And also, James told me that he's working on a biography of Collingwood, so that's also something we can very much looking forward to. Now, this is our third and penultimate session of our autumn seminar. Our final session will be on 21st of December, where we will have Robert Piercy from the University of Regina in Canada speaking about Is Ricoeur still relevant to the philosophy of history? And this will also take place on Zoom. And our motto is after the seminar is before the seminar. So we are already planning now our spring seminar, where we started planning. So if anybody here in the audience, online or offline, would like to speak in our seminar, or you would like to suggest somebody to speak, please let us know, and we will consider. Now, if you want to stay updated about our events and activities, please consider following our social media. We have Facebook and Twitter, or as it's now called X. And of course, it's also always a good idea to have a look at our homepage once in a while. Now, in the very end from me, shortly technicalities. Please mute yourself during James's talk to and avoid any unnecessary disturbance. And after the talk, there will be a discussion session that I will moderate. So if you have any question, especially of the people online, please first indicate so in the chat, and then I will make a speakers list. And when it's your time to comment, then you can either speak up with or without your camera on, or you can write your question in the chat, and I will read out loud. And in the very, very end, James graciously agreed to stay on after the official end of this event a little bit to chat with us. So anybody here, if you also would like to chat on with us, feel free to. We would be very happy to. So thank you very much. James, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you very much for inviting me. I need to confess straight away, I'm having a slight computer problem, so it's probably best if I don't share my screen, because if I share my screen, I won't be able to see my text. So it's one thing or another. So you're going to get the text, not the screen. If that changes, I'll let you know. Now, bearing in mind the wise words of Immanuel Kant, who once apologized for, by saying, I didn't have enough time to make it shorter. My paper at the moment is slightly too long, but I'm going to try to truncate it as we go through. Now, of course, it does think it make it so, Gentile's philosophy of history and fascism. And this does rather raise the question of how the hell can someone in 45 minutes talk about all of that? And the answer to that is, I can't. No one could. What I will try to do, though, is to give at least a sense of some issues relating to this. But at the same time, I'm going to make it very clear that there's a lot of things I won't be talking about, although I don't mind what we talk about in the question time. Now, if this were a Greenaway movie, I'm thinking of the cook, the thief, his wife and her lover, I could call it The Philosopher, the Festschrift, His Philosophy and His Fascism, because I've suddenly realized that there's a certain sort of interlinking set of relationships going on throughout it. So one of my topics is, what's the relationship between philosophy and action, between theory and practice? Is there a necessary relationship, and so on? This is important because for those who advocate a strong relationship, there can be problems. There can be problems in the case of Giovanni Gentile. There can be problems in the case of Martin Heidegger. But today, of course, I'm talking about Gentile and many others. But what are the problems? Well, you like the philosophy, you don't like what some people see as being the practical outcome of the philosophy. That is one of the clear problems in the case of Gentile. He wasn't called the philosopher of fascism for nothing, but that still leaves open the question of to what extent, if any, his philosophy is in some sense inherently fascist, and that if you buy into the philosophy, you're buying into fascism. Now, I'm focusing on the philosophy of history, but in the case of Gentile, as in the case of many others, to focus on their philosophy of history is also to focus on their philosophy in general. There's very often not much of a distinction. But I should say I'm not trying to deal with all of Gentile's philosophy, not even in mentioning it. I'm not going to talk about the philosophy of art, for example. One assumption I'm going to make is that in its main outlines, Gentile's philosophy didn't undergo any really serious change or development after the rise of Mussolini. I have reasons for saying that. I think they're valid and cogent. I'm not going to argue for them right now. I do have people who could support me in this. Rick Peters, for example, various others, including Guido de Ruggiero, who would say exactly the same. So what am I not doing in this paper? Well, I'm not going to give a complete account of Gentile's philosophy as a whole, his views on history as a whole, his political activities as a whole, his writings in support of fascism, including those written for Mussolini. I'm not going to talk about all of those, and I'm not going to give you a history of the rise and fall of fascism. I hope there's something left to talk about after I've denied all of those, but I'm sure there is. Now, in his autobiography, Collingwood, as I'm sure you all know, said, "There was once a very able and distinguished philosopher who was converted to fascism. As a philosopher, that was the end of him. No one could embrace a creed so fundamentally muddle-headed and remain capable of clear thinking." Now, that philosopher was Giovanni Gentile, born in Castelvetrano in Sicily in 1875, where his house, I've discovered, is still the site of pro- and anti-fascist propaganda. And he was murdered in 1944. His erstwhile friend and philosophical companion, Croce, Benedetto Croce, said that Gentile holds the honour of having been the most rigorous neo-Hegelian in the entire history of Western philosophy, and the dishonour of having been the official philosopher of fascism in Italy. Now, as I'm sure you know, Croce and Gentile split irrevocably after the murder of Matteotti in 1924 and the publication of the Manifesto of the Fascist Intellectuals in 1925. But skipping a whole load of things, but I will be turning back again later, let's go to the Festschrift. The Festschrift I have in mind is Philosophy and History, edited by Raymond Klebanski and H.J. Peyton, which came out in 1936. Now, this Festschrift had a particular origin, as it were. On the 30th of January 1933, the Nazi regime came to power. Ernst Cassirer left Germany for England in March of that year. In 1934, Raymond Klebanski, someone else who was in England for the similar reasons, conceived of the idea of a Festschrift for Cassirer and brought in H.J. Peyton to deal with the English contributors. The book was contracted by the Clarendon Press in Oxford, and R.G. Collingwood was the delegate helping it through the press. C.C.J. Webb, a contributor, also helped with inviting authors. Now, some people looking at the volume wonder why Collingwood's name is absent, and they've come up with various ideas and theories. They sometimes infer that he wasn't invited, and that the reason he wasn't invited was because he was insufficiently well known or regarded as a philosopher of history at the time. But I have reason to think that that is false. I'll come back to that in a moment. Let's just remind ourselves of who was in this volume. We have Juan Huizinga, Samuel Alexander, Leon Brunswick, Guido Calogero, C.C.J. Webb, Etienne Gilson, Bernhard Greuthuysen, Giovanni Gentile, Susan Stebbing, Theodor Litt, Fritz Medicus, Emil Breyer, Ernst Hoffmann, Lucien Levy-Bruhl, Fritz Saxel, Erwin Panofsky, Edgar Windt, Hendrik Poss, Friedrich Gundolf, Jose Ortega y Gasset, and Raymond Klebanski. Now, while not all of those names are still household names, many of those names are still very well-known and highly regarded names in the philosophy of history. It's a galaxy of stars, and many, of course, of those names are associated with the Warburg Institute, which was being founded in London at this time. So it's an important volume in the history of the philosophy of history. But what of Collingwood? Why is he not in the volume? Well, we know the answer from one side, and we know it from CCJ Webb's diaries, because Webb says, he wrote in his diary, he received a number of Klebanski's invitations to contribute to the Caesarea Festschrift, which were forwarded to him open by Peyton in case he wanted to add anything to the invitation. And these were addressed, he says, to Bertrand Russell, W.D. Ross, A.D. Lindsay, Samuel Alexander, R.G. Collingwood, A.N. Whitehead. So the interesting point there is that Collingwood was invited, together with Russell, Ross, Lindsay, and so on. So, and these, of course, were not the only English invitees. There were two others. Susan Stebbing, who was a contributor, and Webb himself was a contributor. In the end, there were only 3 English contributors, or English-speaking contributors, because Collingwood, of course, didn't take up the invitation, whereas Alexander did. Now, I don't know why the others said no. I don't really know why Collingwood would said no. He was clearly regarded as a suitable contributor, and he had a reputation at this time as a philosopher of history, both in Oxford and elsewhere. Historical Association pamphlet, 1930, Papers to Mind, the Aristotelian Society. He'd been lecturing on the topic for a decade. He'd just been elected to the British Academy in the same year. By the way, that was on G.E. Moore's casting vote, which is an interesting footnote in the history of philosophy. But Peyton and Webb had known him and his work for many years, so they knew what his interests were and obviously regarded him as a suitable contributor, but he said no. Why not? I don't know. Maybe he was too busy. He was writing on metaphysics and various other things. In reporting to the university in 1932, he said that his Historical Association pamphlet was, in effect, the synopsis of a complete treatise. But he then goes on to add that I do not intend to begin writing such a treatise until I've done several years' work on various aspects of the subject. So maybe he just wanted to do more work first. I don't know. But the interesting effect of his not writing for it is, in a way, precisely that it became a spur to his own later philosophy of history, as we find it expressed in his inaugural lecture in 1935, in his lectures on the philosophy of history, which became, of course, the idea of history in 1936, his Human Nature and Human History delivered to the British Academy in May 1936, and so on, because he focused, well, a lot of his thinking, I think, emerged at that point in his career out of a critical engagement with some of the contributors in the volume, in particular Alexander, in particular Ortega, and in particular Gentile. Now, there is one point just worth mentioning in passing. As we will see, what Collingwood sometimes does in all periods of his thought, but certainly at this time, he says, oh, Bradley said something, it's really interesting. And then he projects into Bradley something that he wishes to say, but presenting it as an interpretation of Bradley. And he does this with Gentile, for example, and Ortega too. He fastens onto something and then attributes to them the thing that he wants to say himself. So there's an interesting engagement here where he's knocking backwards and forwards between these thinkers, developing his own thought, but then in a sense giving the credit to his interlocutor. The next section are called his philosophy. Now, I don't know, and I dread to think what you all already know about Gentile. May I ask, hands up anyone who knows anything at all about Gentile? Okay, I don't see any hands, so there we go. I'm going to have to say something. Quick sketch. His philosophy is a philosophy of consciousness. It confines itself to consciousness in a sense. It resolves everything into consciousness, and it's an immanentist philosophy. He has no room for transcendence. When I say immanentist, I mean one in which the thinking subject must not be separated from the object of his or her thought. Everything is here and now. There are no sky hooks, as people say. Everything is resolved, in a sense, for Gentile into the current act of thinking, which he calls in his own thought, pensiero pensante, thought thinking. This is actual thought, it's reality in the act of knowing reality. And that knowing is, in a sense, knowing itself at the same time. So for Gentile, the only living thought is thought living in the present act of thought. And I'll come back to this. There'll be a certain amount of repetition, partly because there is a certain amount of repetition in Gentile. He tries to say, or he asserts that he is not guilty of solipsism. Now, there are some people who say that he can't leap out of solipsism, but he certainly wants to say that he is not a solipsist. So that in some sense, in thinking or speaking for ourselves, we're at the same time speaking for humanity. In acting for ourselves, we're at the same time acting for humanity. That in a sense, we transcend the self by speaking for all. But we'll come back to that maybe. Wilden Carr, introducing the English translation of the theory of mind as pure act, states Gentile's position in this way. He says, the mind, with and by which we think it, is itself not a thing, not fact, but act. Pure act, which never is, which is never factum, but always fieri, in other words, in the doing. Of the mind which we individualize, the author says in a striking phrase, its immortality is its mortality. Only mind as pure act is immortal in its absolute essence. Only to the doing which is never deed, activity in its comprehension and purity, can such terms as infinity, eternity, and immortality be significant. Now, what that all means, I'm hoping will come in the sequel. But what is the germ of all of this? What is the germ of the idea that, thinking makes it so? Well, the germ for Gentile is Giambattista Vico. For example, in his De Antiquisma Italorum Sapientiae, the wisdom of the ancient Italians, where he says, well, he has a motto, verum et factum convertuntur. For Gentile, he says, this shows profound insight because the concept of truth coincides with the concept of fact. And this comes up again in Vico's Scienza Nuova. And the basic idea, of course, is that fact and truth are convertible one into the other because we can only know what we have ourselves made. We cannot know what God has made, as it were, like nature, but we can know what we have made because we made it. That's the idea that Gentile gets from Vico. But he then wants to change it a little bit in line with his actualism, the distinction of act versus fact, the idea that everything is a doing. He wants to say, verum et fieri convertuntur. In other words, truth is convertible into the doing, not just into the done, but into the doing. And that's something that Gentile just keeps going on and on and on about, so I don't need to quote you every place in which he says it. But that's the key point. We can know what we have done, but really, we can only know what we are doing, which is the present act of thought, which is pensiero pensante. And there's a distinction between the present act of thought and the dead act of thought, the thought having been thought, as it were, which he calls pensiero pensato. The first is the live act of creative thought in the present, And the second is the abstract, dead, objectified thought, which is brought back to life in the live act of thinking. But once it's no longer being thought, it goes back to being an objectified something out there, but no longer alive. Now, I'm going to quote you a passage from Gentile here, and it's a passage from which I think we know, if we look at it, that Collingwood must have learnt from. He says, the idea of history, the idea of the life of the human mind, as seriously entering into the formative process and development of reality itself, was never so much as suspected throughout the whole course of the ancient philosophy. How many are there even today who appreciate this concept of history as progress, gradual realization of humanity itself? The dialectical conception is only possible on one condition only, and that is that in history we see not a past but the actual present. This means that the historian does not detach himself from his material and set up res gestae as the presupposition and already exhausted antecedent of his historia rerum gestarum. In other words, deeds done from our, as it were, reconstruction of the deeds done. History, he continues, presents indeed in the positive character of its events an analogy with nature, but its intelligibility consists in the unity of the real to which it belongs on the one side and in the mentality of the historian on the other. History, therefore, is not already realized when we set out on our historical research. It is our own life in act. If then nature is nature insofar only as it precedes the thought of nature, history is history insofar only as it is the thought of the historian. Let me try to gloss that a little because it's a slightly dense passage. But what Gentile seems to want to say is that as far as dead thought is concerned, history in a sense consists of dead thought, just like nature consists of dead thought. It's something external to us. It's something we regard as an object outside of our act of thinking. In the case of history, we bring it back to life by rethinking it. That's the only condition on which it is brought back to life. So in a sense, the historian does not start with the idea of the historical fact or facts. The historian creates the historical fact or facts, because they only live insofar as the historian is actualizing them. Back to actual idealism, this is what that term means. Insofar as the historian actualizes the dead thoughts from the past, the historian can reconstruct what the past was, but it lives only in the present act of thinking of the historian. So that history, he says, quoting again, is not the antecedent of the historian's activity, it is his activity. This is confirmed in the fact that every organization of historical elements bears the imprint of the historian's mentality. There is not a material element of history which remains point for point the same in the various representations. Now, we will see when we come, that was from the Theory of Mind as Pure Act, which was first published just before the First World War, translated into English just after the First World War. When we come to look at the contribution of Gentile to the Cassira Festschrift, we will see that substantially the same points are being made. And that's why I said at the outset that I'm happy to argue that there is no real fundamental change in Gentile's thought from the earlier to the later. Now, Roger Holmes, in his book on Gentile, which dates from 1937, provides a good gloss on Gentile's philosophy of history, which I hope will make it clear what I've been trying to get at. He says, as we have seen, for Gentile, thought may be considered either as the object of contemplation, pensiero pensato, what we think about, or as the activity of contemplation itself, pensiero pensante. The former is the material of an act of thinking which has taken place. The latter is the act of thinking itself. The former is transcendent, the latter is immanent. He then points out that Gentile does not recognize a distinction between theory and practice. And this is going to be our clue, by the way, of course, when we're talking about fascism. He continues, if action is suspended, it is part of thinking that this should be the case. To use Gentile's own figure, the philosopher does not sit in the second-story window contemplating the hubbub of his fellow men in the street. He joins his fellow men and acts with them. Hence the often expressed identification of philosophy and politics, when the latter is interpreted in the broadest sense as being the entire sphere of practical activity. He then goes on to, and again, this is a quotation, but it's one worth making. He goes on to look at the implications of actual idealism for philosophy of history. He says, with so dynamic a reality, one in which today's truth is tomorrow's error and today's virtue tomorrow's vice, the very facts of history cease to be important as such. The real history is the thinking of the historian in action. Once written, history becomes dead fact, caught up again in the vitality of the real, only as part of the thinking of the historian who follows. Sorry. That's one of those sentences where I got the stress wrong. Once written, history becomes dead fact, caught up again in the vitality of the real, only as part of the thinking of the historian who follows. That's better. So he, for example, is making the point, history is not the bare record of objective and indisputable facts. Consider the bare facts of the history of modern Europe. You couldn't recall them all. You're necessarily selective. It's not even conceivable that someone might write a, quote, objective history of this. The reality of history, he says, is the reality of historical thinking which is actually going on. The material which comes to us from the historians of the past is only the material of the present act of thinking. And that's an important point. Act becomes fact. Fact, as it were, deeds done, then becomes fuel for further live acts of thinking. So, to finish this quotation from Holmes, this concept of history gives a clear understanding of what Gentile means when he says that the act of thinking literally creates the world in which we live, whether it be the nature which surrounds us, the religion wherein we find guidance, or the past of which we usually consider ourselves to be the product. Only in a narrow sense are we the product of the past. The past is far more the product of ourselves. That is a very interesting little passage, by the way, and one we might return to later. And now to the transcending of time in history, which was Gentile's contribution to the Caesarea Festschrift. Now, the way Rick Peters expresses this is to ask, how can the past be a truth condition? If it's not real, if it lies beyond the actual existence, how can it be a truth condition if it's dead? He says there's a dilemma. On the one hand, the past is everything in the sense that it's the truth condition for all thought. On the other hand, the past is nothing because it is not actual. In order to solve this dilemma, Gentile analyzes the concept of the past. And his first step, says Peters, is to show how the past can be known even if it is not actual. And Peters says, to know it in the only way that is possible is to make it live again, to actualize it. And that means to take it out of time and to free it from its chronological character in order to transfer it from the abstract world of facts to the concrete world of the act, the historian's act of thought, to which all facts belong in the synthesis of self-consciousness. Now, I could quote you at great length how Gentile expressed all of these points, but I don't think it's wise to do that at any great length, because I think the gist has already been done, as it were. But I will just pluck out one or two phrases which is worth remembering. One, to come back to one, historical fact is not presupposed by history. What he means by that is that the historian does not find the facts but creates them. Now, this scandalized, I think it was G.H. Sabine who reviewed the volume. He was scandalized by this thought that historical fact is not presupposed by history. But of course, what Gentile means, you might say, is, well, what we have is evidence, and that is evidence for history. And it's in the historian's own thought that this evidence becomes history. And the historical fact, as it were, is something we generate in the act of interpreting the evidence in the current act, the actual act of thinking. But of course, the past is not, in one sense, it's dead. But we have the present. And the present, which is really present, is that of thought. The present, which is past, is part of the world. It's externalized to us. So he then has a little purple passage where he talks about historical science, he says, priding itself on the facts, the positive and solid realities, which it contrasts with mere ideas or theories without objective validity, is living in a childish world of illusion. It little knows how much these facts, so lifelike in their flesh and blood before the eyes of the historian, owe to the thought that calls up their fleeting shades from the kingdom of death, to which as facts they have been justly condemned forever. This, of course, recalls the passage from the book of Ezekiel, where he wants to conjure up, where the ideas of conjuring, can these bones then live, is the phrase in the Bible. Can we conjure up what the past was by examining the dead relics of the past as they present themselves to us? It's in that sort of way that Gentile is speaking. Now, of course, what Gentile is arguing is, well, yes, we can, but how can we? We can do it in the only way that is possible, he says, to make it live again, to actualize it. And that means to take it out of time and free it from its chronological character. We transfer it from the abstract world of facts to the concrete world of the act, and so on. And that's the passage which I already adverted to. Now, moving on. There were some interesting reviews of history and philosophy, the Caesarea Feshriv. One of them came from W.G. de Burgh, who said that Gentile denies any distinction between res gestae and historia rerum gestarum, maintaining that all history is contemporary history, and that history and philosophy are identical in the act of pensiero pensante, which embraces all times and the birth and death of all things in an eternal present. And then de Burgh goes on to say that, the time of history belongs to the moment of objectification and only lives by dying into thought and being reborn sub specie aeterni. So that's the transcending of time in history. What did Collingwood say about this? Well, going back to what I said earlier on, Collingwood is both expounding Gentile, but also reading into Gentile, you might argue, his own thinking. And which then in the end is Gentile and which in the end is Collingwood is an interesting point. He says in his review, which was published in 1937 in the English Historical Review, the journal of that name, he says, one implication of the truth that what the historian seeks to do is to discover the thought of historical agents is worked out by Gentile in a paper on the transcending of time in history. What is indubitably historical is the life of the human mind. Now, for Gentile, mind is the only reality. Nature is only a construction of ideas, a product of human thought, existing and therefore developing with the development of the thought that constructs it. Nature, in the scientist's present conception of it, is not historical, but the scientist's present conception of it is only the stage now reached in the historical development of science, and thus not nature itself. But the reality, the thing in itself underlying it, is historical, being in fact the scientist's thought. Continuing the quotation, time is transcended in history because the historian, in discovering the thought of a past agent, rethinks that thought for himself. It is known, therefore, not as a past thought, contemplated as it were from a distance through the historian's time telescope, but as a present thought living now in the historian's mind, Thus, by being historically known, it undergoes a resurrection out of the limbo of the dead past, triumphs over time, and survives in the present. This is an important idea, and I believe a true one, he continues. Its importance for the historian lies in the fact that, so conceived, history is no longer a story of successive events. That's Bosanquet's phrase, by the way. It's the actual possession by the historian here and now of the thought whose history he studies. And a past whose thought the historian is unable thus to make his own, whether through lack of evidence or through defect in his own mental powers, inability to sympathise with it, is a past at once dead and unknowable. This doctrine has a practical bearing on historical method. It implies that in order to understand a certain past event or state of society, the historian must not only have sufficient documents at his disposal, he must also be or make himself the right kind of man, a man capable of entering into the minds of the person whose history he is studying. Now, anyone who knows anything about Collingwood knows exactly how Collingwoodian, as it were, all of that sounds, but I think we've seen enough to show that it also reads like a translation into idiomatic English of the Italian thought of Giovanni Gentile. Collingwood seemed to have a genius for being able to do this, whereas other translations, simply translated, in one sense of the term. What Collingwood did was to rethink the thought about rethinking, and then presented it in a way where it reads intelligibly and directly to an English-speaking and English-reading audience. But now I come on to fascism. And this is more or less my last section. I've already said enough to show that there might be some difficulties. Now, Angelo Crespi, in his book on contemporary Italian thought, which came out in the mid-1920s, says essentially that fascism is just activity for activity's sake, that fascism is the sort of logical outcome of actual idealism. Now, H.S. Harris, the Hegel scholar, says this is, of course, a shameful caricature of everything that Gentile lived and worked for. But it does appear that with Gentilian idealism, there's no external constraint on thought or action, either from moral absolutes or objective truths, or from empirical absolutes or objective truths. And this is what opens up the space for concern, and it's a concern shared by, for example, Herbert Marcuse in Reason and Revolution in 1940. He says, all its fundamental motives show Gentiles to be the strict opposite of Hegel's philosophy, and it's by virtue of its being the opposite that it passes directly into the fascist ideology. Identification of thought with action and of reality with mind prevents thought from taking a position opposed to, quote, reality. Theory becomes practiced to such a degree that all thought is rejected if it is not immediate practice or immediately consummated in action. Gentile's theory of mind praises anti-intellectualism, foreshadowing the typically relativistic traits of fascist philosophy, to be noted in the repudiation of all fixed programs that go beyond the requirements of the immediate situation. Action sets its own aims and norms that may not be judged by any objective ends and principles. Now, I should just say that I think there will be plenty to argue back at both Crespi and Marcuse on these points. But the very fact that they, together with many others, make this link between the philosophy, the close tie between theory and practice, and the fascist character of the philosophy means that there's at least here something we have to think about, because however you look at it, Gentile thought that that fascism was compatible with his philosophy, whether or not his philosophy led, as it were, by ties of entailment to the fascism may be a different matter, but at least there's a strong affinity or compatibility from Gentile's point of view. Now, and we can see why we might say there's an affinity. This is my summary in a nutshell. Thought is primary. Thought is action. Thought is social. In other words, a pure act is a social pure act. Therefore, in thought and action, I'm part of a wider whole. He called this the transcendental ego. Gentile asserts supremacy of the transcendental, not the empirical ego. But of course, someone must speak for this ego if empirical egos disagree. And who is this to be? Well, Il Duce is the answer. Now, that may be a very small, compact, and possibly misleading nutshell, but you can see where I'm going with this. Now, is there any logical entailment between the philosophy and the fascism? We might say, no, it's just Gentile. He did one thing, then he did another thing, and his philosophy never really caught up, whatever. But he seemed to think there was a good enough fit. He didn't seem to think there was anything he should disown in the philosophy when he became a fascist. So at least there's an affinity. But maybe the other point is this, is the philosophy helpless against fascism? I think that's what De Ruggiero in the end thought. That is, that actualism was not inherently fascist, but it left you with no defences against fascism. But then for De Ruggiero, neither did Croce's form of historicism leave you with any defences either. So, there's a real issue here. Now, clearly, if we think of historical knowledge merely as knowledge of an object, a past object separate from us, then we have a separation of theory and practice, of thought and action. And knowledge of the past has no implications for us. We've discovered it, not made it. But if we think of it as creating the past, of historical knowledge as creating the past, and also creating ourselves through the act of creating the past, the situation is rather different. And this is the issue, because we're seeing that Collingwood wants to maintain those propositions. And it was an awkward matter for Collingwood. He was committed to the unity of theory and practice. We find this throughout his writings. So he's got a problem with Gentile. He's praising Gentile in 1936, for example. He also wrote to Knox, T.M. Knox, translator of Hegel, in 1923, that philosophy tries to be the theory of life as distinct from life itself. The philosopher is the spectator of reality, but the theory of life is life itself, or it is nothing. You cannot spectate reality, you must be it. But compare that with Holmes's gloss on Gentile, that the philosopher does not sit in the second story window contemplating the hubbub of his fellow men in the street. He joins his fellow men and acts with them. What exactly is Collingwood committing us to here? Because insofar as Gentile's philosophy could be claimed to have implications for fascist practice, how can Collingwood jump off that particular bandwagon in time to avoid a collision? Now, clearly, Collingwood wasn't a fascist. Plenty of evidence for this. We know he was an anti-fascist. So he's got a problem. I think the answer is that Collingwood seems to think that becoming a fascist destroyed Gentile's ability to be an original philosopher. That's what comes out from the quotation I read earlier. Now, this means that the earlier pre-fascist that the earlier pre-fascist thought was immune from fascism, but the later work would not so much be fascist as be poor philosophy or a repetition of earlier philosophy. So what I'm arguing here really is that that Gentile ended up stultifying his own thought by his adherence to fascism. So that, for example, Gentile, according to De Ruggiero, developed a tendency to shut himself up in one or more formulae, which is wont to repeat and to amplify and vary with invincible monotony. He says that in 1926. Now, what follows from that is that Gentile's thought, generally speaking, his philosophical thought I'm thinking about, is a repetition of his earlier thought. So from that point of view, you can find value in it because it's exactly the same value, perhaps expressed a little differently, for what you would find in earlier thought. So that it would then follow that Collingwood can both denounce Gentile for being a fascist He can say that his fascism stopped him being a good philosopher, but he can also praise the Transcending of Time, the essay of that title, because essentially it's restating earlier thoughts, but thoughts that Collingwood is sympathetic to. And also Collingwood is in a position to say, well, if you look at Gentile's philosophy of art, you can see that fascism destroys his ability to think, because he's not saying anything new. And insofar as he is saying anything new, he's not saying anything worth saying. So that sort of would be the answer to the way in which Collingwood thought about Gentile's fascism in relation to the philosophy. It just killed the philosophy, but the philosophy was not itself inherently fascist. But whether we can get Collingwood off the hook, I don't know. By the way, I shouldn't imply that Collingwood accepted all of Gentile's philosophy of history. He did not. But we can perhaps come back to that in discussion. I said right at the outset that I wasn't going to talk about some things like, fascism in Italy as a historical fact and all the rest of it. But it is just worth saying one thing about philosophy of history in a different sense of the term. I mean, the sense of the term in which we talk about someone having a philosophy of history in the sense of knowing how history is going to be, or talking about the course of history as a necessary product of its own past, or knowing the laws of history, or whatever. We can ask lots of questions about this. And Gentile, separately from his philosophy of history as I've been describing it, seemed to think that fascism was an inevitable outcome of Italian history. And in fact, he even rewrote history to prove it. His gloss on Vico wants to prove it. He wants to have Vico and Croce as precursors of fascism. He writes of Croce as a philosopher as a fascist without a black shirt, for example. And Aline Leon, in her book, she studied with Gentile, by the way, but also with Collingwood, also with C.C.J. Webb, also with J.A. Smith in Oxford. She wrote a book called The Pedigree of Fascism. The title of that is immediately interesting, because it implies something. It implies that it came from somewhere. You can trace its antecedents. And indeed, in that book, she claims that the antecedents include, among others, Mazzini, Vico, Croce, and Gentile, and then Mussolini, and various others. So it has a pedigree. It came from somewhere in history. So, and Gentile himself seems to want to make the same claim, that it's the inevitable outcome of Italian history. Benedetto Croce, on the other hand, thought that fascism was, in his own phrase, a parenthesis, an unfortunate parenthesis, but a parenthesis that had neither parentage nor offspring. Problem was that his form of historicism could account for it in no other way, or better and more precisely, it could not account for it at all. So, there's a problem there. Croce was the great anti-fascist eventually, and it wasn't a straightforward story, but his own philosophy seemed to be unable to account for what was going on. Croce's view might not lead to fascism, but was unable to provide a defense against it. Now, we may want to discuss all of those things, whether or not, for example, we can make links between various understandings of history, various understandings of the philosophy of history in different senses, and our ability not so much to conjure fascism out of it, which is what people say about Gentile, but to conjure up an antidote to fascism, which is what I'm just saying Croce cannot do, and what De Ruggiero, later in his life, when he wrote The Return to Reason, said also you can't do. You've got to go and seek some other points of principle in order to provide a bulwark against fascism. We can discuss those things, but what I've been arguing, and I'm now concluding, what I've been arguing and what I've been saying is there's an interesting story. It's the story of a philosopher who wrote interesting philosophy of history, but compromised his reputation for all time by becoming Mussolini's fascist philosopher. But he was a contributor to a Festschrift, which I think itself needs to be more fully examined and considered as being a seminal work, at least in Collingwood's development, but possibly in the development of the philosophy of history itself, certainly in the UK. I don't know about outside the UK. And I've raised other questions about fascism and responses to it, which will provide us with something to think about. But the main thing I wanted to think about in relation to that is, what is the relationship between thought and action, where thought appears to take an activist nature? Gentile may be right to want to stress the actual reality of the thinking subject, which is at the same time the object. But in so doing, has he simply led us straight down the garden path to a form of politics that we hope never see resuscitated again? Thank you very much for listening. I'm happy to listen to your questions. Whether I can answer any of them, I'll lead you to decide.
Okay. Okay, thank you very much, James. I was alerted we will come to the discussion session now to introduce the people who are in this room. So here with us, we have, I was just leaving, we have Aviesa Taka, we have Jouni-Matti Kuukkanen, and Josephina Doro. So anybody who knows a bit of history probably knows most of those names.
Yes.
Okay. Okay, and myself, but I introduced myself already. So is there any questions here in the room or online? Immediately then. Please, can start. Please, yeah.
Hi, James. There seems to be a certain ambiguity or inconsistency in your interpretation of Gentile's presentism, without me knowing really much about Gentile. Because on the one hand, there seems to be Vickian idealism, that is, because human beings made history, and history comes from the modification of the human mind, then we have an epistemic guarantee that we can understand that. We can understand human action, we can understand human thought, and we share in this kind of idealism, we share the kind of ideals that people in the past had, in a way that natural scientists cannot utilize epistemically, because nature was not made by human beings, so we have no guarantee that we can understand nature. On the other hand, you presented this presentism in evidentialist terms, that because the evidence is in the present, then the historian works in the present with the evidence. And that is, of course, entirely free of any type of idealism or metaphysics altogether. So it seems that it's not just that these are two different versions, they're actually inconsistent in their metaphysical assumptions, whether it's idealist or evidentialist. Another related question would be, again, I'm not an expert on fascism, but one characteristic of fascism is decisionism, that is, actions that are taken without reason, without rationale, that it's the primacy of action to thought. And that, again, seems to be in contradiction, at least with the idealistic aspect of Vico, where action is a manifestation of the modification of the human mind. That's why we can understand past action through this modification of the human mind, rather than action be primary, arbitrary, decisionistic.
Okay, thank you very much for both of those. It's interesting that you raised the point about evidentialism, because that wasn't actually my original text. That was something I inserted to gloss the point, and maybe I shouldn't have done, simply because it's too broad a term in a sense at that point. I mean, I would still stand by its truth in a sense, but of course it applies beyond what I was speaking about at that point. So whether that takes away the ambiguity, I don't know. Whether the interesting question for me is whether the ambiguity is also there in Gentile, or whether it's one that I just introduced myself into my account of Gentile. I'm inclined to think that it is there in Gentile, but I'd have to go back and check the text to be certain about that. I think if we're talking about others, it's probably there in Collingwood as well, by the way. Because it's the sort of example that people tend to look at. You know, nothing is evidence unless we can ask intelligent questions of it. Thereby, it becomes evidence for the present act of thinking of the historian, that sort of line of thought. But put that way, it's fairly unexceptionable. But put in the stronger Vickian sense of creating the past, then it's a different matter. So yes, there is an ambiguity there that I need to consider. So thank you for that. The point about decisionism is well taken, and it's one that I might have said a bit more about when I was talking about Harris's objection to Crespi, and indeed the objection one might make to Herbert Marcuse. That is that Crespi and Marcuse both, in effect, want to say that Gentile is, in effect, a decisionist, in the sense of, you know, you act and think about it afterwards. You act and justify it afterwards. And indeed, you know, when, for example, Gentile, as he did at various times, taught about anti-intellectualism, he did use those sort of phrases, true. But of course, the interesting point here is that essentially experience and thinking is mediate for Gentile, not immediate. So he couldn't be a decisionist in the crude sense of the term. And that is one reason why Harris wants to let him off the hook of that particular charge, because, you know, as he says, you know, Crespi's account does disservice to Gentile because it mischaracterizes Gentile as someone who is simply an activist or a decisionist, as though the deed, the action, was separate from the thought. But of course, for Gentile, the two are necessarily entwined. So, you know, in one sense, the idea of being a decisionist separates thought from action and then says action has primacy, whereas Gentile wants to say, no, thought and action are the one thing. And it is its own self-justifying act of thought, or thought in action, which matters. And of course, when Gentile, as I said, uses a term like anti-intellectualism, what he really wants to do is not to say that people should not think what they're doing. What he's trying to say in context is that we have a problem where some people think of themselves as only theoretical without taking responsibility for their thought in the world. And if there's a relationship between thought and action, they should take a responsibility for their thought in the world. They cannot, as it were, separate themselves from their world. So I think you can sort of get Gentile off the hook, but at the same time, you can see how people reading Gentile could very quickly assimilate it to an understanding which would be more appropriate to a fascisti squadron on the streets rather than to Gentile's study and the thinking he did in it. So in a way, it still raises a lot of the questions are still unanswered, because Gentile did go so far as to justify the use of the cudgel, for example, you know, and he, you know, joined the fascist party and didn't leave it when Matteotti was murdered and so on, you know, so he still justifies violence. He even goes so far as to say, well, it's not even as though Jesus was that much against violence, you know. In which he sounds like an American crazy Republican saying that sort of thing, you know, where they remold Jesus in their own image. So I think there are still tricky issues for Gentile here, but I think we can allow him the benefit of the doubt in some quarters at least.
Okay, thank you very much. David Cianin online had a question.
Okay, thank you very much. I believe it was partly answered previously, but I was still thinking, because I have done a little bit more of reading of Collingwood than on Gentile. I have been looking through the doctrine of fascism, actually, just to get acquainted with his style of writing and with the ideology. I remember clearly the passages there when he is bashing intellectuals who are just focusing on thought instead of doing political action. And so I was thinking, because I also remember Collingwood when he's speaking about practice, about his historical and archaeological laboratory, when he goes to recognize how historians are actually producing their knowledge. So I was thinking, you basically said that they both share big respect for the practice, but I always thought that in the sense of Collingwood, the practice was the inquiry, historical inquiry itself, but not the political practice or ethical practice. And when you spoke and when you quoted Gentile several times, I thought that his idea of practice was a little bit more connected with a political action, political practice than with practice as an inquirer or researcher. Or maybe I understood it poorly, but can you maybe a little bit expand on that?
Yeah, that's a very interesting point, because there is a passage in Collingwood's autobiography where he talks about theory and practice. He talks about himself as being a leader, and but he means the leader of archaeological studies in the north of England. He's talking about people being, interpreting Hadrian's Wall and expounding to an audience the interpretation of Hadrian's Wall and so on. And indeed, you may not know this, but he was informally called by many of his archaeological colleagues at the time, Duce. So, which is an irony, but in recognition as the leader of Hadrianic studies. Now, that is a form of practice. I mean, only last week I was visiting an archaeological dig, which has been reopened, which was Collingwood's last archaeological dig in 1937. It was reopened in order to check interpretations of it. And, it felt more like practice than like theory, I must say, because most of the time I'm sitting in my study and standing with my Wellington boots in a muddy field, gazing down on, bits of stuff that I couldn't understand, felt very much like practice. So that is one distinction, and you're quite right about it. And I think in the earlier Collingwood, that's how he might have thought of it. And I think Gentile certainly always thought of it as being about ethics and politics, and said so in a very public way. However, and this is my reversal of what I've just said, although there is that distinction in Collingwood between theory and practice, where practice means, as it were, archaeological work, historical work in and on the ground, as it were, it's very clear from his lectures on ethics from 1923 onwards, and it's very clear from some of his other writings for example, in Speculum Mentis, first words of which are all thought exist for the sake of action, that he didn't restrict the notion of practice, as it were, or action to archaeological or historical practice, that he thought of it as being economic, ethical, political, whatever. And the purpose of thinking was in order to, as it were, fulfill the requirements of practice, to inform practice. Now, at the same time, of course, it's true that from the late 1920s onwards, and especially in the mid-1930s onwards, Collingwood became much more politically activated, as it were. What do I mean by that? What I mean by that is that he became explicitly anti-fascist in the 1920s, because he was a friend of Croce, friend of De Ruggiero. He did meet Gentile, but didn't want to have a lot to do with him because he distrusted his fascism. And he says this quite openly in his letters to De Ruggiero and so on. And of course, he translated De Ruggiero's The History of European Liberalism into English. Now, my point there is that writing that in 1925-26 by De Ruggiero is a political action. You're publishing it, La Terza, in Bari. It's a political action. Translating it is a less courageous political action, but nonetheless, Collingwood saw it as a political action. He was endorsing this as against fascism. By the mid-1930s, he could see the effects of fascism and Nazism, not only in what he learned firsthand from the Italians, but also what he learned in firsthand from the German and German-speaking people who were coming to Oxford at that time, hence the outspoken pages in the autobiography, where he then asserts very roundly that the unity of theory and practice includes politics. And he's saying this very strongly by the time of that last chapter in the autobiography. So he's then, in effect, announces himself as an anti-fascist, anti-Nazi thinker. So that's where he ends up. Now, that Collingwood was very strident. He was less strident a decade before. But of course, you might argue there's a lot more to be strident about by 1938 than there was in 1928 or 1923. So I think, while what you say is a correct impression, it's a misleading impression. I think Collingwood was thinking of theory and practice in all dimensions. It's just that some of his examples at some time refer more to the practice of history rather than the practice of politics. Because, of course, in one sense of the term, Collingwood was not politically active. So far as I know, he, never joined a political party, never canvassed for a political party. His notion of contribution to political practice was mostly to write about it, so that it was an attenuated form of the unity of theory and practice in his own actions. But that's partly because that's what he thought he could do best. He's probably a better author than he was a canvasser knocking on people's doors. However, of course, he did endorse A.D. Lindsay in the 1938 Oxford by-election, where he was explicitly standing against the appeasement candidate. So he did take part in public declarations from time to time as well. But the stridency of his advocacy of the unity of theory and practice was in his own self reflected more in what he wrote than what he did in the world. I think that is what I would definitely concede to the way you were reading it.
Thank you very much.
Thanks. There's Josie first.
Okay.
Please.
Okay. Thank you, James. So thank you. This is really a general question, which is probably prompted by the fact that I guess generally I am, I'm trying to sort out what it is meant. What is it that people mean when they speak about the relationship between theory and practice and the unity or not the unity of theory and practice? And what comes to mind is that there are some philosophers who clearly think that there is no need for continuity. So Hume thinks that, for example, that you can be a skeptic as a philosopher, but then you sort of live the philosopher's study and you just believe in induction and so on. So there are some philosophers who think that there is no obligation to provide a philosophical theory that continues with our practical engagements with the world. And I guess that a lot of naturalists today would be like that. So they would say, look, what really exists is whatever your latest scientific theories does, and everything else must go, or something along those lines. And they don't think that philosophy really should save the appearances in any way. Yeah. And then, on the other hand, I suppose there are idealist philosophers, like, let's say, Kant, just to sort of use a neutral example, who would say, well, actually, in some ways, we've got to provide a story about why we think of ourselves as agents. And then he gives transcendental idealism and confines empirical realism to the realm of appearances and so on. And that's a way of sort of explain, that's a theory that is, I suppose, at least makes sense of our everyday ways of thinking of ourselves as agents and so on. But I guess, so when I look at this in this kind of example, I sort of think that there are, perhaps idealist philosophers in that way, in that sense, tend to be more like descriptive metaphysicians. They don't give us a metaphysics that is revisionary, that requires us, and that tends also that tends to be, I suppose, scientistic in a way. So they tend to be more like descriptive in their metaphysics. So they tend to do more justice to the appearances. However, what I don't see, I think, is if one is an idealist in that sense, that has anything whatsoever what to do with certain specific political beliefs. I mean, I can see that there is a sense in which idealists can save the appearances, but then in political life, I mean, that doesn't seem to have a kind of, and maybe you do think that as well, but it seems to me that to save the appearances in some ways, as idealists do, in at least some idea, or maybe most idealists do, I don't know, doesn't really have any, it doesn't have much of, it doesn't say much about, your political views or your, so I just, it's just, I can say this is just a very general question, but I just wonder what you think about that, because I guess I'm sort of slightly suspicious of this view that, people's philosophizing in some ways has that kind of, or at least a certain idealist view may then lead to certain sort of political views that are somewhat suspicious. But yeah, it was a bit of a muddled question, but
well,
probably makes some sense.
It certainly does. It also shows the complexity of the question, though, and I think this is one thing I certainly glossed over, and I think it's what a lot of thinkers gloss over very quickly. So, I mean, I'm not quite sure where to start. I'd start by making one distinction, that is, in the case of Hume, for example, we might think of it as being, what are the consequences of our thought for the way we are in the world, just in a general sense, when we go out to the study, do we believe in induction or not? That sort of thing, whatever our philosophical doubts about it. But that's not an ethical question or anything, it's not a political question, but it is a question about, if you take, say, Berkeley or someone, who's an immaterialist, but did it make any difference to, what he did? McTaggart didn't believe in the reality of time, but as people always point out, he had his breakfast before he had his lunch, and after that he had his dinner, sort of thing. So, there is that sense of, just being in the world. What difference does what you might call an abstract philosophical view make to what you do in your daily life? Now, in the case of Gentile and Collingwood and those sort of people that I've been talking about today, we're talking more here about ethics and politics and so on. Now, I think there's a number of things one can say here. One is that the first is a very general point. People are fond of making grand statements. But the question is really for us, what do these grand statements mean? Because what I find, for example, when I look at Collingwood, is that he very often makes a grand statement which is strong and then retreats to a weak statement, which is still asserting a relationship between theory and practice, but of a weaker and less direct type. It's what you might call an indirect relationship between theory and practice. But of course, that's a long way from this idea of the union of theory and practice. So what I mean is, for example, and I'm thinking various places in which it said something like the following: the task of theory in relation to practice is to rid practice of misunderstandings which render practice, impossible or difficult or whatever. So it's not that we prescribe to practice, but what the philosopher does is to try to analyze practice on behalf of practice and get rid of misunderstandings which would prevent the progress or something. But that's a weaker understanding than the idea that somehow one's philosophy leads directly to a particular ethical or political point of view. So it's the idea that the way you think about the world has implications for what you do in the world. Philosophy, as a systematic way of thinking about the world, therefore has implications for what we do in the world, because thinking has implications for what we do in the world. How we conceptualize the world makes a difference to how we operate in the world. So go back to Croce. If we, or Croce, Gentile, any of those people, if we think, for example, that something is inevitable and it going to happen independent of human agency, because that's what our philosophy of history, in the strong sense of that term, tells us, then we will be quietists or defeatists in relation to political action. If, on the other hand, our philosophy of history tells us that we are creative agents in history and can act now to make a difference, then our philosophy will tell us that it's worth acting. And this is the sort of point that, for example, Walter Benjamin was making about this sort of thing. But of course, that doesn't tell you what it is you should do. It merely tells you that it's worth doing something, that what you do might or could or should or whatever make a difference in practice. So I don't know whether that's answered any of your points, but what I've tried to do is to show that one has to immediately start disentangling the sort of things that people say about this in their grander moments from the sort of thing they are forced back to saying when they're asked, what exactly do you mean about the relationship between theory and practice? Now, Collingwood made a big issue of this, but I think he tended to retreat. Gentile maybe didn't retreat in quite the same way. But the problem then for Gentile is that the philosophy, and I'm distinguishing the philosophy from what he wrote on behalf of Mussolini to justify fascism, because you can't always say that that's philosophy in the sense in which his purely philosophical books are. You know, his philosophy has, I would say, quite a loose fit with fascism. It's not obvious that fascism is the necessary outcome of the philosophy. So he may argue that there's a relationship between theory and practice. What you think makes a difference to what you do, but it doesn't follow from that what it is you do or what you should do. Please tell me whether I've answered any or all of your concerns.
I think you have. Thank you.
Okay, Jouni-Matti.
Yeah, well, thanks so much. This is very interesting, but you also got me worried. And the reason is the way you connected some of the core elements of Gentile and to fascism. And the reason is basically that they remind me of pragmatism. So, for example, the unity of theory and praxis, the big key idea. Then in the beginning you talked about fact and truth is convertible to doing. So the whole idea of between thinking and doing, or primacy of doing, or primacy of practice, is a very much the principle of pragmatism. And I could mention, for example, Dewey's idea, and that we are not like spectator. We don't have a spectator account of knowledge. So spectator account of knowledge doesn't make any sense. We are actors. Or Wilfrid Sellars' idea that truth is a semantic assertability. It's assertability. It's something that we assert, the act itself, of course, with certain conditions. Of course, we could also have Latour, which is not the pragmatist, but well, goes that way somehow. His idea of fact, that is, facts are made, and when something, a belief with negative qualification, suspicions, is finally turned into a silent acceptance, then it becomes a fact. And it's also this kind of practical doing kind of principle. And then if all this means this unity of theory and praxis, or primacy of praxis, if that links to fascism, I would be very worried. Unfortunately, I didn't see the conceptual link so closely there. So I just again not knowing fascism so well, but I guess we would need a bit richer definition of fascism. It's maybe along the lines of personality cult or irrationality, or belief in physical force or something like that. So I guess my question is there anything like a conceptual link from the thoughts of unity of thinking and practice to fascism? And it seems to me that there isn't. And the final point I want to add is obviously, some philosophers like Rorty and Brandon are also talking about practice, and it's exactly maybe the denial of transcendence that you said in the beginning. So, but Rorty says that, okay, some people have belief in transcendence or believe that they have the objective of truth or something like that, and that's just some sort of self-delusion. So it's better to think that actually all we have is our claims, our best claims to what to believe. So that all is what there is, knowing and knowledge is in the action itself, in the discourse itself. And of course, in this case, it leads to more like to democracy or democratic.
Yeah. Thank you for that. I mean, there's a lot in there, and I'll try to respond to what I can. Let's just take pragmatism to start off with. I mean, some people have drawn attention to affinities between Gentile and pragmatism. I can't remember this second exactly where and when, but I have seen them and I can find them easily enough for you. But then, and I think there are, but I mean, the curious thing there is that someone like Collingwood, for example, has disdain for pragmatism, but admiration for Gentile and the idea of thought existing for the sake of action. Now, it may come down to simple questions like, the theory of truth or something like this. In which case everything would rest not on the idea of a link between theory and practice, but on the way in which pragmatists define truth. So, or it may, of course, just be that the pragmatists that Collingwood found in Oxford at the time he was writing were an unprepossessing bunch. Because very few people remember FCS Schiller, who was a pragmatist in Oxford. Although some people are trying to rehabilitate him a little bit now. When people talk about pragmatists, they're thinking about Dewey and Peirce and so on. And when they're thinking about those people, I don't know how much Collingwood ever knew about those people. So I think he was responding locally rather than universally on that. Now, the question of the link with fascism, I mean, I suppose there are two dimensions to this. One is, if you assert a relationship between theory and practice, does that mean that you're necessarily linking, going in the direction of fascism? I would say no. But then, yes, you may be right. You're going in the direction of democracy. You could go in the direction of liberalism. You could go in all sorts of different directions. At this point, it's just it's a box, it's a container without any content. In one sense, it doesn't tell. It's only telling you, making the assertion of the relationship between theory and practice, that there is a relationship between theory and practice. Not telling you what that is. That has to be filled in. Now, for me, one of the things I find with someone like Gentile is that although you can read it and you can get quite interested in it all, when it comes to the content of it, it's hard to find what the content is. What are the actual claims being made as distinct from his method? Because what he's really promoting is a way of thinking about things and resolving them into the present act of thinking. That's really what he's getting, and then refusing to distinguish that from acting. Thinking and acting are one thing. Now, fair enough, but that doesn't tell you anything about the content. And he, of course, would say, no, it doesn't, because the content is what is given to you by the facts in the world, insofar as you are able to assimilate those and make them your own. But to use the word in a non-technical sense, that's a very abstract way of looking at it. It's not telling you anything about the content of the act of thought. It's simply telling you that in order to have a content of the act of thought, you, in your current act of thinking, needs to grip onto things which appear to be external to you, make them your own, and think them yourself. That may be very inspiring, but it tells you, to use an English phrase, bugger all about anything in the world, you might say, except how to think about things in the world in a certain way. Now, insofar as it tells you about how to think about things in the world in a certain way, it can be valuable. If someone comes along to you and says, well, we know what history is, so therefore we don't need to have historians worrying about it, it's quite a good thing to come back and be able to give them an answer saying, look, we don't know. You know, we only think we know. But every time we go and have a look, we have to re-know, as it were, relearn, rediscover. So, you know, it can act as a prophylactic against a certain way of thinking about historical knowledge. When it comes to theory and practice, I think the case is quite different, because all Gentile is saying is that there's a relationship between the two. The content in relation to a particular political conclusion, I think, is a very different matter. Now, just to answer it empirically, De Ruggiero, Collingwood, they both followed Gentile's actualism to a great extent. They modified it, they rethought some of it, they weren't adherents of all parts of it, they were skeptical about various parts of it, but certain key points, certain core points they followed. But Collingwood was anti-fascist and was a liberal. De Ruggiero was a liberal, you know. So they both clearly thought that there was no entailment, or if even the weakest thought, between the actualism and any particular political or ethical conclusion. So that, I mean, you know, what follows from that? Well, what follows from that is that you've got a philosophy which tells you about the unity of theory and practice, but you don't know what the practice is just by reading that philosophy. That's where you get with Gentile. It's only the waters are muddied because Gentile became a fascist. You might argue that had he never become a fascist, no one would have thought about this. I don't know. Now I'm beginning just to speculate in a very idle sort of way. So my short answer to your question is, I think there is no necessary link to fascism. I can see, on the other hand, how some people can find a link to fascism. But whether they're simply finding that after the fact, as distinct from deducing it, you know, from the philosophy, I think it's a very different question.
Okay, I'm not sure how we are with time. I would have a question too, if I'm allowed to step off from my...
Yes, no one online then.
Well, from my role as a moderator, and I'm not sure if this is a well-thought question. I was just thinking about this general relationship between political ideologies in a non-pejorative sense and philosophy. I'm not sure how much can be said on a general level, at least I cannot, but I thought there are some very strong positions that we can rule out, right? Most people, for most philosophies, don't believe they are like an identity, as they always say, or an expression, a simple expression of political beliefs, right? I mean, even with figures like Heidegger, people will usually say, most serious thinkers will reject, it's just Nazism. And I guess you can say that also for Gentile, even though I don't know him. And when you see who makes these claims, it's usually those people who don't look at this philosophy in detail anyway. So there were examples last year, you know, when Foucault perhaps has molested boys in Northern Africa. His whole philosophy is wrong. Judith Butler said some really crazy things about Hamas. Her whole philosophy is wrong. You know, it comes out of her philosophy. It's an identity with the philosophy. So that's, I think anybody who does seriously think into other philosophies don't say that, right? At the same time, if we define that sort of politics and philosophy can only be connected to each other if there's something like what you said, entailment or a logical relation, whatever that means, then we won't find very often either any sort of relationship, right? So I guess the question then, I wrote this word from you out, can we give a good definition of terms like strong affinity, elective affinity, compatibility or something on a very general level? That would help us if we could do, and I'm sure if we can. And then, of course, there's another question, but all of this is sort of not linked to, or at least separate to. We can have all different moral positions. We can say, if Foucault molested boys, that's morally beyond the pale for us. I don't want to engage with the philosophy whatsoever. I mean, that you can make that claim. You can even make the claim it shouldn't be taught at universities, therefore. I'm not making that claim, but you could. So you could still have you could still be very much against political implications by a moral argument, which is totally detached from the question of the relationship between the philosophy and the politics, right? I'm not sure this was a question, but that's what.
Molesting children is hardly a political position.
Okay, fair enough.
It's an identity thing, which this kind of flip, because classically the left said it doesn't matter who the person is,
Right.
And the right said, well, we want them to be virtuous. Now they flipped. Now the left wants everybody to be virtuous, and the right doesn't give a damn about people's personal life. But it's not the same story when you have personal behavior and sort of strong political affiliation. That is, in the case of Heidegger, I would go for the formulation of Rockmore of the relationship between the philosophy and the politics. Rockmore said, neither sufficient nor necessary, but hardly surprising.
Yeah, I think that the Rockmore's phrase is a good one there, and probably might apply to Gentile. I don't know. I'm just reminding myself of it because it's been a while since I looked at that particular thing. Let me just start from the back and work our way in. I mean, I think an interesting case would be, say, Frege. You know, I mean, Michael Dummett was shocked to discover that he was a rabid anti-Semite and so on. But of course, given what Frege was writing about, it's not really the case that that made any difference to any of the philosophical or logical claims that Frege was making. So I don't think it caught, you know, Dummett hated the person in a sense, but he could still love the philosophy. It's harder to do that possibly with Heidegger, or more generally with someone who is propounding a philosophy with clear ethical implications or clear political implications. You know, it's a different matter where you can't really separate the philosophy from the practice in the convenient way you can with, say, Frege. So in the case of Heidegger, we have that sort of thing. In the case of Gentile, we have that sort of thing. I think in the case of Heidegger, it's more obvious in a way than it is for Gentile. Now, we know that Gentile became Mussolini's sidekick, and he wrote a lot of that stuff. But if we're just talking about the philosophy, it's not obvious. Can you read off the politics from the philosophy? In the case of Heidegger, at least on my looking at Heidegger in relation to this, it seems to be that, as you say, you know, quoting Rockmore, it's less surprising to find that the politics goes in a certain direction. In Gentile's case, I could easily have seen it going in a contrary direction, as indeed it did with Collingwood or De Ruggiero. You know, you can easily see it going in a different direction. But of course, that leaves aside a slightly different question, which is the question of whether it should have led in one direction or another logically. Now, because you can take different views here. One is to say that there can be no logical entailment, weak, strong, or whatever, between a purely philosophical position and a political or ethical or whatever position in the practical world. Some people would take that view. They'll just flatly deny any relationship between theory and practice. You know, Oakeshott might take that view, for example, or at least he might claim to take that view in experience and its modes. Collingwood can't, because he expressly says that the modes overlap and so on. So what, going back to the starting point, we're talking about, you know, strong claims. What can we rule out and what can we rule in, as it were? Clearly, in the case of a philosopher, there are always people who want to use anything that the philosopher who says and does as a way of discrediting that philosopher. But of course, or crediting in some cases. Must be a good person because he or she did X. Well, it doesn't make any difference, you might say, on one level to the philosophy either way. So there are standard jokes, of course, about, you know, moral philosophers, about whether they're truly moral or not. And of course, we can look at that both ways. We can say, look, philosophy isn't about, cannot be, as it were, disproved by your private life and what you do in it. The philosophical claim can still be true or false independently of what you do in your private life. Now, what would the person who asserts a strong relationship between theory and practice want to say there? Well, they could say many different things. You know, one might be something like St. Augustine, you know, make me moral, but not quite yet sort of thing. You know, it could be that. Or I would like to live up to my moral ideals, but I'm just incapable of doing so. I've had an attack of akrasia lately, you know, that sort of thing. You know, weakness of will keeps getting the better of me. Or I would like to be a philosopher, but, you know, joviality kept on breaking in sort of thing. There are lots of different ways of expressing this sort of point. That is, you separate the thought from the person and then say the person isn't an ideal person because, like every other human, he or she is subject to weakness of will. But what we're really interested in is the philosophical relationship between theory and practice. Now, if you're talking about that, yeah, I think we can rule out certain claims straight away, because I think we can rule out the idea that just because a philosopher is a bad person individually, in some sense, that therefore their philosophy is necessarily invalid. However, I think we have to allow the possibility that if their professed philosophy seems to issue in something which they are then happy to profess as a point of principle in practice, then that would be a rather different matter. So, you know, when Heidegger becomes a rector or whatever, when Heidegger endorses certain things, when Gentile endorses certain things as a public statement, and when that person is saying there's a relationship between theory and practice, then I think it's fair to go back to their philosophy and say, well, okay, what is that relationship? Maybe your philosophy has doubt cast upon it by the fact of your particular political engagements here and now, because you are the person who articulated the philosophy and articulated that there should be and is a relationship between theory and practice. So I'm not really getting any further in answering your question directly, by the way, Georg, obviously. But I think the questions you raise are the only proper questions to raise here. That is, we have to look into the detail. So going back to my earlier point, on the one hand, we have the grandstanding view. There's a big relationship between theory and practice. Yeah, doesn't tell us very much, because that can come from either side. It can come from the philosopher, or it could come from the, you know, the gutter press saying, well, so-and-so's philosophy isn't worth a dime because this particular person is a nasty piece of work, you know. But both of those are equally shallow and empty. The real interesting question is, let us look at the lines of relationship. So if Collingwood or Gentile or Heidegger can say, I have a philosophy which has implications for practice. Here's what those implications are for practice. This means that we can rule out certain forms of practice and not others for the following reasons, then I'm prepared to give credence to that. But unless they start spelling that out very carefully, then I don't really want to take too much notice of their grandstanding.
Yes, thank you very much. That sounds reasonable to me. Is there any questions anymore? I mean, time is a bit advanced, either online or in the room.
Let me just, because going back to the earlier question, the answer about the method, and I really like that. Is it a direct quotation of what you said about how to think about thinking about the world? Is that?
Well, I think that was my explanation of it, but nonetheless, that's what I think is in it. I mean, that's, I think, for Gentile, I mean, I think that really is the point.
Right.
And I think people like Collingwood also pick up on that.
Yeah.
So I'll just give you an example just before we finish. I mean, in his piece on political action, Collingwood is very clear, for example, that it's very hard to understand a lot of things politically if you think of them only in terms of substance and attribute. We need to think of them in terms of activity.
Mm-hmm.
You know, so if you think of the state as an object standing over against me, then it's just something which blocks my way. If you think of it as being the interrelationship of human activities expressed in a certain sort of way, but subject to change, modification, and all the rest of it, then we can reconceptualize things in a better way, thinking of politics as activity in which we all engage, rather than as something which stands over and against me. Now, of course, that is not to deny that, the state can punish me and all the rest of it, but it is to deny that we get anywhere by simply thinking of these things as something out there in the world, like a natural object facing me, which I can't do anything about and which I have no real engagement with or relationship to. Now, that's part of what Collingwood's trying to say in that article. And I think he gets that notion from Gentile, and I think it's a reasonable notion to get from Gentile, because it's a way of thinking about the world as activity, as opposed to other ways of thinking about the world, which just don't, in my view, get you so far. So yeah, the idea of it being method, I think, is a good one. Maybe I should just make that more explicit.
Yeah, it's great, because it invites us to think about what the method is. I mean, what are the procedure, what are the rules, what are the values? Obviously, it can be better and worse values. But the key is that we have the right epistemic and other values, or kinds of reason-making principles.
And it would apply to other things too. I mean, Joseph Raz's book on, what's it called? Realizing value or something, I can't remember. But again, the same sort of move is being made. Don't just think of values as being these objects that we've discovered as though they were natural facts in the world. They are what you might call concretions of our activities. But the primacy there in the end is the activity of thinking about engaging with, restating, questioning values. Again, it's just a way of just looking at it from a different angle, you might say, and it can be quite valuable in different spheres of philosophy and life.
Yeah, thank you.
Yes, thanks. Maybe that's a good end point, unless there's really an urge to speak still. But I think we can finish it here. Thank you very much, James. Thank you, everybody online. Thank you, everybody in the room. We'll see you next time on the 21st of December. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you very much, everyone.
Yeah.
Bye.